Good afternoon, everyone. Everyone hear me okay? Am I blowing anybody out there? Welcome to our afternoon session on personal data, an asset and a liability. My name is Josh James. I'm an attorney with Bryan Cave, specializing in data privacy and security law. And I'm here to guide you through a discussion with our four panelists here, who I'll introduce in just a moment. We wanted to let you know that if anyone had any questions during the presentation, feel free to shoot an arm up, and we'll be happy to chat back and forth with you and make it as interactive as you care to. It's always a lot more fun, a lot more interesting if there's some give and take between the audience and the presenters. We've already run two folks off, so let me introduce our panelists here so that maybe you'll stay. Vinny Lingham is a South African-born Silicon Valley technology entrepreneur who is currently the co-founder and CEO of Civic, a blockchain-based identity management startup. He was also previously the founder and CEO of Gift and Yola Inc. He also appears on the panel of investors of the local edition of Shark Tank and Dragon's Den South Africa, and he blogs regularly about blockchain and Bitcoin technologies at vinnylingham.com, and is also on the board of the Bitcoin Foundation. Vinny? Peter Davis has been involved in the identity management domain for over 20 years. As a Neustar distinguished engineer, he serves as Neustar's chief identity architect and security architect. He currently focuses on identity and message security standards at Oasis, the Kantara Initiative, and IETF. He also served as an editor and co-chair for the Technology Working Group for the Digital Entertainment Content Ecosystem, LLC. Stephen Palley is a trial lawyer based in Washington, D.C. office of Anderson Kill, a fellow of the American College of Coverage and Extra-Contractual Counsel. Mr. Palley represents policyholders seeking insurance coverage with a particular focus on emerging technology and software development. In addition to his insurance coverage litigation practice, Mr. Palley has worked closely with clients in the design and development of a variety of software platforms and draws on his hands-on experience to advise a client about product development, design, and risk transfer mitigation. Lavonne Reimer is a founder and CEO of Luminess, a data sharing platform that puts small businesses in charge of their credit profiles to share on their own terms. Lavonne brings decades of experience designing and deploying data-driven applications involving identity and privacy sensitivities in markets as diverse as awarding academic credits, offering financing, or auditing government grants. Luminous applies interactive machine learning to resolve data structure and provenance issues in user-supplied data and promote transparency and accountability in credit decisions. She is also the founder and CEO of SynQuest, a provider of web-enabled graduate degree programs. And with that out of the way, we'll do a little bit of level setting with each of the panelists. So I'd like to start on the end with Vinny, and we'll come this way. I'd like you to briefly explain to everybody sort of what your background is, what types of data you're currently working with, both personal and non, and what types of risk you confront because of that data.
So my previous company, it was called Gift, and we basically did online gift card sales. And one of the things we had to do was verify credit cards, because a great way to take money off a stolen credit card is to buy a gift card, and then the chargeback comes months later. So we dealt with this problem of ID verification. And so when I left to start my new company, Civic, what we did was we rethought how would we do remote ID verification and how would we do it in a secure way using blockchain and cryptography. And so what we basically done is we've built a system or platform where we as Civic don't store any data, but we use cryptographic signatures to hash and confirm data. And in doing so, we're able to have a very light footprint. So we could have 7 billion people on our platform using our network, and we would know nothing about them generally. And that makes it very safe and unhackable to an extent, because if we don't hold the data, we can't get hacked. We decentralize it on devices, so your personal device has your data, and it's not stored anywhere else. So it's kind of maybe an extreme view on things, but in our view, because we don't need to hold any user data, we don't. And that's kind of every company has to be somewhere in that spectrum between nothing and something based on regulatory compliance. But where we sit as a technology vendor, we don't have to hold it. So that's kind of our view, is how do we get people from the one end where they're collecting absolutely everything about a user to somewhere in the middle, or even to maybe closer to our end, because having less data that you have to just worry about, protect, store, makes you less susceptible to hacks and data breaches And the biggest problem right now is correlation. So people are able to hack multiple databases and find out information about you, and use passwords from one hack to access accounts elsewhere. So this is becoming more and more of an issue.
Lavonne?
I'm a former lawyer who likes to talk a lot, but today I have a sore throat, so I'm going to be sucking on a cough drop, and I'll have to keep my comments to a limit. Apologies for that. The origins of Luminous came out of something I did after my first startup and before this one, which was to work with Open Source Development Labs, which is now Linux Foundation, to conceive a global virtual incubator. And we were thinking about the individual hackers who would try to make money off of their code, and all the way to startups that were scalable and had the potential to go public. And so the thought was, how would we vet this diversity of businesses, which would have a diversity of credit needs? And out of that, I came to know the people who were working on the OAuth protocol. And they were just convinced the whole world was going to go to OAuth like immediately. So they said, Lavonne, you have to be our reference implementation. Get going now. So I did. Way too early. But I'm just bringing that up because when I think about personal data, the vision that I had back then was how powerful it would be for people to be able to harness their own data and share it. And that, I just had such a clear vision of that such a long time ago. And it's been astonishing to me that the model instead around fintech and big data credit and underwriting has been more a case of collecting as much data as you can and holding that data internally for predictive analytics or scoring whatever product output exists. So that's a little bit in conflict with how we thought about, or how I've thought about personal data. Having said all of that, there are several facets to what we do because by going against the credit bureau or the black box model, we're fundamentally a personal data story. That's what we're about, is that you know your own data and you share it on your terms. But the second piece of it is that we take a mix of data. Anything that the business owner wants to pull into their profile and that creditors might request can go into a profile. So some of this is things like LinkedIn profile, your LinkedIn information. It might be your credit score, the FICO score for the business owner, and certainly financial data is a big piece of it. So those are different characters of data. But because of the context of my business and I are being evaluated, it all becomes personal. And that's really been fascinating to me to see how it transitions because of the context. And so we really take that position, even though we spend most of our time dealing with how to break apart financial information and protect it at a fine-grained object level. We have to respect the fact that to our users, the whole profile is personal.
Peter?
So Neustar, at its heart, is a data analytics company. That's our primary focus. We have a platform called OneID, which is a horizontal fabric, if you will. It's not actually technology. It's actually more like an ethos in the way we think about how we engineer software and store data and all of that. At the very beginning of the design of that system, we took a privacy-first principle to make sure that we know we're going to be keeping data. We anonymize our data, so to a great extent, it's not PII. However, we know that it's sensitive, and we know that it needs to be governed properly. To those ends, and for the last 15 plus years, I've taken the approach of looking at how technology, and specifically industry standards, can bring forward privacy best practices, security best practices, consent. All of those things have evolved as technologies over the last 15 or so years as our thinking about it has matured. Liberty Alliance, which was one of the first areas where we started this, was the first standards body that I participated in that had a public policy group. And it was a room full of lawyers, and they were familiar with regulatory environments all around the globe. And they engaged the Article 29 committee, the U.S. Government, to consult and collaborate with them to actually make sure that we could realize, in the case of policy documents, what industry needed to do to actually make this work. And so much as OneID did, Liberty Alliance took a privacy-first approach as well. And I'd like to hope to think that, this continues to evolve. The most recent standard to come out in this space is the consent receipt from the Katara Initiative. And it's a pretty powerful thing to have approachable consent that consumers can understand.
Stephen?
So I live in somewhat of a state of professional cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, I'm an insurance coverage lawyer and a trial lawyer. I've been practicing about 20 years. And if you think that the practice of law is Dickensian and backwards looking, try spending a lot of time reading insurance policies or handling insurance coverage disputes. This is not a criticism of the insurance industry or of the law practice. It's just an observation about reality. The other part of my life involves helping companies develop software. So I have basically one foot in the 19th century, some days in the 18th century, and another foot in the 21st century. In a way, maybe I'm a bit of a translator, or you might also say I'm a dilettante. I'm not sure which it is. Maybe we'll only know at some point in the future. My interest in data and personal data is in part as an insurance coverage lawyer. As a coverage lawyer, you are placing assets into buckets. Is it something you own? Is it first-party property? Is it something that you can have a risk related to? So is it is the thing for which you're trying to hedge risk? Is it something that's related to a potential third-party claim? And I spent a lot of time working with clients, helping them to identify the risks associated with data. One of my favorite projects in the last couple of years was helping develop a direct response advertising platform that used SMS. And I realized as I became engaged in the business that very difficult balance between risk, are you sure you should take that piece of data? When you parse the HTTP headers and you save those to your database, you're getting a benefit. What is the benefit that you're getting, and what is the risk that's associated with it? I also realized, I asked a client at an early stage in a project, have you thought about a software project? What about insurance? And he said, well, I could get insurance, but then I couldn't pay my developers. And I realized that the best insurance is to build it right the first time. It's not just getting an insurance policy. That's kind of a sort of an overview of how I look at personal data privacy, both from the standpoint of something out of a Charles Dickens novel and something out of an appreciation of the difficult choices people have to make in software development and business.
Speaking of those difficult choices that folks have to make, I want to talk with each of you about how you manage the trade-offs between holding that valuable asset, that data, whatever it may be, personal or not, as the point was made, and how you minimize the risks associated with hanging on to that, whether it's data minimization itself, insurance strategies in particular, contractual arrangements. Lavonne, could you kick us off and talk about what your organization is doing?
So there are a couple of things that we do. I mean, one is, I mentioned that we take in financial data, and it's very, very sensitive to a small company because these are privately held. They're not obligated to disclose except in the context of this private exchange, with a creditor. And so we break that down in a truly fine-grained manner. So everything's driven off of attributes. So I guess it was attribute-based access controls before that concept was really fully coined and fleshed out. But that's what we do, and I just have to add this in the real world anecdote to that. I'm really proud of that bit of it, because it just all of the flexibility around what you share and when you share it. But every one of our users has said, and by the way, we're just launching now, but we've run a lot of pilots. So when I talk about those users, that's what I mean. They come back with, well, I really don't know what I should share, so can you just pick it for me? And so we have templates, defaults, and I could see a lot of evolution in this. So I'm glad we've done it the way we have. But it's interesting that people just really want to be able to know that they're sharing the right amount of information for what that relationship requires. You talk about, though, holding on to the data. So one of the other things we do is if you think about what does a credit bureau do, they clean data, they make it consumable, and they stand behind it. And so there's this kind of idea that you need a third party to bless the data as trusted. So if you take the intermediary out of the middle, which is what we're doing, we have to do something about fidelity assurance. And the way we're doing that is associating all of these sharing activities with the bits of data so that we can draw a conclusion. And we're not really scoring it. It's almost more like a percentage of completion of your profile is how we're doing that. But that sort of implies that we have to see the streams. We have to be able to track the streams at all times. And I think that we're going to see an evolution of more kinds of federated structures that will allow us to get away from that. Because this is a little bit of my lawyer risk-averse saying, I just don't want to hold stuff if we don't have to. But we need to be able to provide that assurance. So that's a bit of a conundrum that we have to deal with.
Well, Vinny, your company has found a way to sort of do that through the blockchain. So can you discuss with us how you conceptualize that initially and what you see as the primary benefits of going with a nearly fully decentralized model?
So actually, it's when we start looking at the models today around federated IDs and OAuth in particular, one of the issues we had with the systems there's just a lack of privacy for individuals. So when you use Facebook Connect, Facebook's tracking exactly where you use it. They're effectively attesting that you are logged into Facebook, and therefore the site that's receiving the credentials knows that that's your Facebook account, etc. But the problem is now Facebook has the data. They know what sites you're using, when you use it, etc. And so the problem with OAuth is essentially that you've got this middleman that's always tracking you, whether it's 1 or 5 or 10, and your data's sitting in multiple places. So when we re-architected the model, we actually built it in such a way that you use the blockchain as a sort of source of, as the middleman, because the blockchain is effectively a static ledger. It doesn't track when you read it, or you can run your own node, etc. And so we call it chain auth, but basically it's a protocol that allows people to log into, using the ID credentials which are verified, to log into third-party websites without having to have the person who attested to the credentials be aware of that. And so that is a kind of a new way of thinking about it. It's very new. We're just we're busy launching it right now, and but it has all the privacy built into it, because now it's just really the user and the site they're logging into, the only ones that know that transaction happened. And so now you're actually tightening the spectrum of data, where data is being split and shared. And so when it comes to federated approaches as well, it's the same thing. It's always there's always a privacy sort of loophole in that. So we focus on being a privacy company over and above an identity company. And when we think about things like data trails and sort of correlation of data from one source to another, we thought that was important. So our view is the more we can enable the same activities that Lavonne's talking about, but without having to allow data sort of splitting between parties where it's need to know basis. If someone doesn't need to know, then it shouldn't be the case. It's the same with using a driver's license. When you walk into a bar and you show your driver's license in the offline world, unless the barman's got a photographic memory, he's not going to remember that. He's not going to remember anything about your driver's license. In the digital world, when you show your identity, there's always a trail. Someone's keeping track of it. And so, how do we move to what is more analogous to the offline world, where the issuer of an identity is not aware when you're using it?
Peter?
So I think I'll go back to a place where I did deal with personally identifiable information, and that was in the work we did in developing standards for ultraviolet, which was the DECE reference he made earlier. Ultraviolet, for those that may not be familiar with it, is a rights locker system that is shared amongst online retailers. It had a grandiose vision initially, which involved multiple DRMs and multiple device manufacturers, all interoperating in a standard way. Neustar operated what we called the rights locker of that, and is basically a central repository of record, a set of receipts that the retailer places there and says, Peter bought Batman. Except that the retailer doesn't know it's Peter, and the other retailer doesn't know that it was Walmart that sold it to me. And when we were developing these standards, again, much like from my background in Liberty Alliance, Ultraviolet was launched in individual countries one at a time, and based on interest and velocity of retailers and things of that sort. And for every new region that we launched in, we had a whole new document that was the governance and privacy requirements in the regulatory environment of that country we're launching in. And we took great care in how we did essentially a reverse federation in this case, where you had lots of relying parties and one coordinator who did the authentication. And we took great care and responsibility to make sure that it stayed that way, both from a operational discipline and software development standpoint, as well as in the standards development work that we did to make that all work. I'll tell you from experience that taking a rigid approach in doing privacy in your standards development, that you start making software developers unhappy because it's a heck of a lot more work. But on the other hand, you didn't have to engineer it in later when you realized, oh gosh, I didn't think about this before. And so I start seeing that pattern over and over again now in industry where technological work, standards development work that's been going on actually does take a privacy-first approach for the first time in a very, very long time.
So, Stephen, we've got federated, reverse federated, completely decentralized. I imagine as an attorney working with a variety of clients, you've seen sort of a full mix. Have you seen anything that we haven't heard about today?
Well, I come at this from probably a fairly simple-minded analytical approach. I'm thinking about these different approaches from the standpoint of risk transfer, risk mitigation, insurance. Let's say it was the 19th century and I was building a building and I wanted to insure it. There's a certain kind of insurance policy I'd get. I'd know how to value the building. If I want to do that today, if I want to build a building, I'm going to get a builder's risk insurance policy. I know how I'm going to establish the limits. I'm going to get general liability, workers' compensation. I'm going to require that the architect and engineer have professional liability insurance. I'm going to be able to offload certain buckets of risk into insurance policies. And while I cannot quote verbatim all of the language in a general liability policy, they're standard. These are forms that are promulgated by insurance company organizations, and I know basically the bundle of risks that they carry. The challenge I see for businesses that traffic in or have to deal with identity and electronic data more generally is that old models of insurance haven't necessarily caught up. So, and insurance markets and capacity haven't caught up yet. And if you see, when you're dealing with major data losses, in order to understand the extent to which insurance will apply, you cannot undertake the same analysis that you can take if a building burns down or if a plane crashes. So, from a very simple-minded standpoint, it's very challenging to counsel a business about how they can offload or mitigate risks and losses in some more traditional methods or modalities. I think the insurance industry will catch up eventually, but not to go on about this, but if you want to predict the future, look at exclusions that insurance companies add to policies. It's seriously, in 1998, ISO amended the definition of property damage to exclude electronic data. In 2001, they added an electronic data exclusion. They also added a mold exclusion, which was silly. A couple of years ago, they added drone exclusions. The insurance industry has not yet caught up. And so for me, the problem I have in advising my clients, each of these approaches has risks. And I'm not sure, I think decentralization and blockchain is interesting. I think you're moving some of those risks elsewhere. Insurance, for me and for my clients, is it doesn't necessarily provide the same easy to understand solution as it once did.
Okay.
It doesn't really answer your question, but that's the way coming.
That's entirely okay. Like any good lawyer, I will not answer the question you ask. I'll answer the one that I want to answer. That's perfectly fine. Jumping from the 19th century to the 21st century, I wanted each of the panelists to talk about technology, things just on the horizon that excite them about ways to minimize their risk. And I'm going to start with Vinny, but I'm going to add one caveat to you. You can't be just blockchain. I need the next step. I need bleeding edge type stuff here. So if you would.
Put me on the spot there.
And it can be an iteration, the next flavor of blockchain, something along those lines, just not traditional.
Yeah, no. I think we're moving to a world where international trade is, to a large extent, becoming easier with ID verifications across board ID verifications, and there are emerging markets where look at India now, where they've got Aadhaar, which is the ID system that they're using now, and I think like 1 billion Indians have got identities, digital identities. They just got hacked recently, is another issue. But you've got that happening. You had the ransomware attacks recently as well with data breaches there. So data breaches are becoming more pronounced, and so you've got this problem where there's more data available by people, but it's also more available to everybody, especially in the dark markets. So I'm quite interested to see how this all plays out, because you've got emerging technologies like biometrics, but what happens when the data gets out? How do you prove it was that person? So I think identity proofing is an area which is interesting and evolving quickly, but it's difficult to predict where it's going to go.
Okay. Lavonne?
Well, I just want to say that I would have described what we're doing as decentralized, but then you guys came along and you co-opted the term, damn you.
Which guys?
Blockchain. Oh. Sorry, I just had to say that.
If you hold the data, you're not decentralized.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
What if you access the data?
Who?
Anyone. If you don't hold it but you access it, is there a distinction?
Would you still consider that decentralized if you just had the ability to access it?
Oh, no, sure. I mean, that's kind of where things are going. I mean, I don't know how technical the community is here, but like products and protocols like IPFS. I don't know if you know, IPFS is fantastic, because basically the future would be you as a consumer have a data store. Think of it as in the cloud, and essentially your data is all stored there. And so when a company writes data, they write it to this little data storage unit. And when you delete your account, you basically revoke access. So in the future, the idea is that all your personal data is stored in one central location, and all the companies of the world basically pile the data in there, and they only have access to what you've authorized them to have access to, but you can leave them at any point in time and take your data with you. But that's probably 10 years away.
What he said. A couple of thoughts on it. I would love to see that day. And I guess the way I translate it is, I know a little bit of technology, but I'm not big on the jargon. But I would just say it's almost like APIs, like everything is API driven. Mm-hmm. And so you have, in our world, that would mean I create my profile and it has this data, which is coming from other sources, some of which are publicly accessible. But how it works together, the context is offline someplace, and then you just make the calls at the appropriate moment of time. Which
the technology exists, by the way. This is possible today.
Yeah.
The problem is that without regulations or governments forcing it, no company would want to do this.
Right.
Because most companies don't. They want to own the data and they want to analyze it, and so regulation. I mean, I think that data breaches and the bad stuff's it has to get a lot worse before people start saying, okay, from now on, the consumer chooses where they want to store the data, and they can revoke access from any point in time.
So my cynical response to that is that as I call it, the follow the money theory of personal data management, because if your valuation as a startup is driven off of how much data you have, and that's what you've led within your pitch, that just puts pressure on you to hoard that data. Mm-hmm. Right. So we're trying, even with our business model, is one aspect of how we protect personal data is to not make money off of data. So kind of mitigate that temptation in some ways. Yeah. The other thing, so I am interested in blockchain. I have probably a relatively narrow view of how it fits in our world, just simply because for small business owners, their commercial relationships are the lifeblood of their business, and that's very relationship driven. So to be able to share data, to socialize data in a seamless sort of a way is really meaningful for them. So I haven't been able to square that with how I see blockchain at this point in time. One development that is intriguing to me just was published by the Google research team in April, and they called it Federated Learning. So they're talking about how you can have a machine learning system that works on mobile apps where the data stays with the mobile app. Like how do you make each one of these individual devices become a contributor to a collective intelligence? So going back to what I was saying about the dilemma about holding on to data for us is that it's the constant sharing that tells us its fidelity. So if there were a way to do that through federated learning, and I'm not a big federated person, but if there was that concept, I think is a really intriguing one, because you can start to imagine we don't have to be taking on the risk of constantly being able to track and see all of this data.
Peter?
Well, so I do see a trend in centralizing data aggregation as opposed to federating it to a large extent. And from a security profile standpoint, federated systems are really hard to defend. And the more attack surfaces that you place around your data, which would be 75 service providers that are holding birthdays here, driver's license there, just also increases the risk factors involved, right? I can manage one point of control, and I can put a good risk profile around it and understand what those risks are. It is a much different thing to now have to ask every one of my service providers that's holding parts of my data that they have to own up to my risk profile that I choose. And that's highly unrealistic as a business model. The company that's servicing me is going to accept my risk demands, right? That's completely turning it on its head. In terms of technologies, and especially in terms of data aggregation and technology, the one area that I see that is still emerging, rapidly evolving, is connected devices, is the IoT, and in the standards work that's going on there, again, the industry sort of had started in fits and starts, and they got tripped over themselves, and they messed some stuff up and made, Barbie dolls with cameras that spied on their children, and underwear apparently is now something that I want connected to the internet. And so IoT, again, like some of the other specs, the standards that I've worked on in the past, is retrenching and slowing down the progression of connected device technologies to make sure that they don't get it wrong twice, because that would basically shoot their other foot. And the world would become very disinterested, or at least consumers would become disinterested in connected devices. The industrial applications for IoT are just immeasurable, and you will see that take off very quickly, and that's where risk profiles are even higher.
So, Stephen, from an advisory standpoint, what are you talking about with clients, to the extent you can share with us, about these sorts of new technologies and new ideas? Is there anything in particular that excites you from a legal standpoint about this technology is going to solve one of the problems that I see facing multiple clients of mine?
So I coined a phrase a couple of years ago. I think I did. I call it the
priming the pump.
It's the first law of it's the first. Yes, it's priming the pump. I came up with that actually. It's called the first law of Lomodynamics. And my concept is when somebody tells me they've gotten risk out of a system, that they've removed it, I don't believe it. Risk goes somewhere. So my question, if you're talking about federated ID, if you're talking about instead of something being centralized, it being decentralized among 100 different providers or 1,000, or it's everywhere in the world, my question is, where does the risk go? And it is, old-fashioned, old world, insuring a construction project where you've got an owner, a prime contractor, and 100 subcontractors. That has some complexities. If you're suddenly dealing with 100 different vendors, it's difficult to see insurance as old-fashioned insurance as the kind of solution that you might have for a building burning down. But just like there's risk, there's opportunity. Things like microinsurance or insurance. Not to get blockchainy, but smart contract insurance, where you can actually potentially attach some sort of insurance or hedge to a thing, even if it's a piece of data, and you can effectively transfer the risk of loss along with that piece of data. That's interesting. I don't think insurance markets, and it's not a criticism of insurance markets, which are heavily regulated, I don't think you're going to see insurance markets being up to that challenge in the near future. It may be that in 100 years, perhaps insurance as we see it is something that doesn't exist. But the ability to take small pieces of data and provide small pieces of something insurance-like along with that, I think it's intriguing.
Peter, I was going to ask for a brief time check here to get a gauge on how much we've.
2 o'clock.
We're already too long?
No, 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. Okay. Okay. Next topic that I wanted to discuss with everybody were pieces of advice, because you've all dealt with dealing with these sorts of risks in the past. You know what's worked for you. You know what hasn't worked for you. So a piece of advice from each of you on how to get somebody out there over the hump with their management or with somebody else within their organization, how to help them understand these risks and how to help their counterparty figure out ways to minimize these risks with them. So, Vinny, I'll start with you.
Always throw the tough questions to me. I want to talk on the point of moving risk around, right? So
Sure.
let's just go back to that for a second. If you have the risk all centralized if you had 7 billion pieces of 7 billion people's ID information, all their PI in one central database in this room, for example, like as an insurer, it's very risky, right? It would be
That's the old Willie Sutton quote. Why do I rob banks? Because that's where the money is. If you've got 7 billion pieces of PII here, that's honeypot.
But if I may, what's interesting is an underwriter, we might think it's stupid, an underwriter can look at a company like Neustar, understand their security, know where stuff is, and price it. It fits an old underwriting model.
Sure.
Whereas they might look at, like, if I decided to do it, they might look at me and say, you're out of your mind. We want to insure you.
So I just had this idea, actually, since we're here in D.C. Some of what we're talking about with distributing risk broadly does take me back to when I was a litigator and I filed a lawsuit against the federal government. Nobody was responsible.
Right.
I mean, is that possible, that if you fragment your risk enough?
Somebody always ends up holding the responsibility, even if it's not fair. But I didn't mean to cut you off, because you're going to a place that I think is interesting.
So if you have risk centralized in one place, even if it was 1 billion pieces of information on 7 machines, like, the risk is highly centralized, right? But the moment you take that data and you say, well, everyone, for example, stores all their own data on their own devices, each individual hack, you'd have to basically get access to the phone or hack each phone independently. That reduces the cost of a breach massively, because now instead of one breach being worth 7 billion records, one breach is now one record
Unless
effectively.
the flaws in the device or the software on the device,
Sure.
or the design of the distributed system.
Right.
That's the law of Lamodynamics.
Yep.
Right, in which case you have 1 billion of attack points, right?
No.
And the vastness of the data risk is now equal to that if it were centralized.
I'm
not suggesting you're wrong. I think there are.
But my point is the value of total failure is so, in other words, if one server had 7 billion records and one person gets in, all that data is out, right? But it was distributed. You still have multiple devices, multiple manufacturers, different operating systems. In terms of, you'd never get all 7 billion in one go. So from a risk perspective, you'd have to basically write a piece of malware that would access every single phone type. It wouldn't happen. Like, it's not technically possible for that to happen.
What, maybe you didn't patch Windows NT?
Well, no, but that's Windows, right? So what about Mac? Like, my point is, there's different operating systems, different versions. It's very difficult to get one attack vector to go in and clean up 7 billion devices.
Fair.
I'd say it's way more. Like, on a scale, it's easier to access one machine than it is to access 7 billion machines.
But does right? I certainly take your point that it's much more difficult as an attacker to hit all 7 billion machines, but it also makes it correspondingly more difficult as the person trying to create that system and monetize it to build a platform that will work across the 7 billion varied machines as well. Do you see that as a technological hurdle that can be overcome?
No, that it absolutely makes it harder. Won't disagree, but that's the challenge, right?
Well, and figuring out how to. I mean, I'm not saying insurance is a solution. It's certainly not an end-all or be-all. It's something that if you have a business, your contracts all require that you have. And maybe for arbitrary reasons, it's difficult to insure distributed systems. And I think it'll be interesting to see if or how the insurance industry comes around.
But one insurer would have to go and reinsure. They couldn't take the risk. Like, think about it. Let's say that it was $100 billion worth of risk on that one server. Insurers have to go then and reinsure all that, because they couldn't carry the risk themselves. But with a distributed system, you could say, well, we'll insure this part of the system.
Yeah, so even for companies like Neustar, where we do hold the data in a small number of locations, each classification of data, and we have 5 different classes of data that we manage, none of which is PII, carries its own risk profile, and by definition carries a different security controls and entitlement management and all of the stuff that goes into managing your risk at the technical side, right? And that we pin each vertical stack, if you will, of risk in different categories with different types of defenses and monitoring and the like. And so in a way, even we do it distributed. We just don't do it 9 million times. We do it 4, 5, 6, 10 times.
My point is that the risk does get distributed, but the question is, as an insurer or as a company, do you want how distributed do you want the risk to be? You can go from fully centralized to fully decentralized or somewhere in the middle.
Well, and Stephen, this may be part of your idea about microinsurance, but to use Peter's idea about parsing out the various types of data, I mean, could you foresee a system or a set of contracts in place where you buy in and you say, oh, I'll be the underwriter on this type of data for X number of users for a given platform, and then you could parse it out and tranche it out and figure out how to best distribute it. Do you think that that's obviously 100 years from now when the insurance company catches up? But
it's kind of a back to the future model of insurance. If anybody here is anybody here familiar with Lloyd's and how the Lloyd's markets work? So Lloyd's market has used a slip model of insurance for centuries, where basically different underwriters agree to insure a percentage of the risk, or even a percentage of a percentage of the risk. And they use things called slips because that's what they are, the little paper slips. In an odd kind of way, the micro-insuring data transfer or identity ownership in a distributed system, there is some parallel there to the slip or subscription insurance model system. It would take some teasing out, but I don't think it's the way insurance works. If there's money in it and you can make money on the float, insurance is a great business. If you've read any of Warren Buffett's annual letters, it's a great business. You take money from people, you take a little bit of money from a lot of people, you insure it at a tax advantage basis. You invest in a tax advantage basis, and you make money in the float, and then you don't pay claims until you're forced to. So if there's a way to monetize this in a way that will make regulators, and I'm not being, he's basically said that, except for the not paying claims.
See, I wasn't imagining that this was going to get to an exciting conversation about insurance.
It's always exciting when I'm.
So it kind of makes me think about relational databases, because I thought database was settled, and then along came NoSQL, and all of a sudden it got terribly fascinating with all these debates and arguments over exactly what the structure ought to be and what would make it protectable and sacred. And that's how I'm hearing the insurance conversation. We parse things out too. I mean, we're not dealing with something like ID specifically, although our system can be used for a certain level of KYC verification. But we break apart the data that we think is most sensitive. And so theoretically, by parsing that way and storing it separately, it makes it harder for anyone to go in and find out exactly how a particular small business is performing. But then I think it's kind of irrational to waste a lot of time hacking to get small business data anyway.
Right.
It's just not going to move the markets in any compelling sort of way. But,
circling back around to the original question that I posed.
I want to take a shot at that.
You want to take a shot with the advice piece?
If I can contain my throat here a minute. So I've been fascinated by the whole privacy professionals industry. As a former lawyer, I guess that's why I've been intrigued by a lot of the discussion of privacy by design. And I actually think that there's much more compelling and innovative opportunity in just thinking about embedding privacy into architecture. The same thing with consents and agreements. So we think a lot about this dance between the interface in which there's some sort of equivalent of a negotiation over how much data am I showing you to make your determination, and what conversely are you saying you need from me, and I had this idea that there's something like this living, breathing concept of agreements that then can be associated with data. And I think, I guess the bottom line of it is to not think in terms of the privacy policy is ever enough. I don't think anybody really thinks that anymore, but I sometimes hear that. But then just to start thinking much more creatively about the human element of understanding what you've agreed to and how that flows through is how to think about architecting. And I came down to DC about a month ago on the train, and I was sitting next to this engineer who was telling me about healthcare data, that they were going through this whole process of architecting a system, really sensitive, mostly health research data. And they brought bioethicists into the room with the architects as they were looking at, like, how are we going to build this thing? And he said it's the most fun he's ever had. I mean, and he was saying it genuinely. But I think we should see more of that kind of immersion and integration of thinking about how we build what we build and how we deal with personal data.
Okay. We've hit our time, so I'm going to ask Peter and Stephen to both give me sort of closing thoughts, or you can answer the question about advice to folks as well. I think we've had a good discussion here, but just to give you each an opportunity for a short closing remark.
So, I mean, I think your point is well made, and I had mentioned it earlier when I was describing the work at Liberty Alliance, that, embedding technologists with lawyers, sometimes good things happen.
Infrequently, but
and to the extent that as technologists we can invite them to participate because they understand aspects of risk and security that the technologist perhaps doesn't actually appreciate. And so I agree. I think we're going to see a lot more trends of that nature where privacy and security are thought of first before features and functionality.
I'm going to rephrase that advice as get to know your lawyers and treat them well. Stephen?
I mean, a piece of advice, I give my clients this, if you want the data, like, why do you want it? What's it worth? And where did the risk go? And don't tell me there's no risk. Like, it's your business, but figure out where the risk has, who holds it, and then make a business decision. Be smart, and remember, I'm not a Title 18 lawyer. Title 18 is the criminal code. That's something I've repeated too. But to your point, I think there's a lot more work can be done between technologists and lawyers. So thank you.
Join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion today. Thank you guys so much.